Now, a kernel panic certainly seems like a really good time to panic, but I assure you, just because the kernel panics doesn't mean you should, soldier. But really, kernel panic just means that something went wrong with the kernel. Now, there's a couple common causes, and there's a couple things we can do depending on what the root cause is. Now, if all of a sudden you're starting to get kernel panics and you haven't done any system updates recently, and it's kind of hit or miss, it'll happen, it won't happen, it happens when you're doing something but not another, chances are you may have a piece of faulty hardware. And this is one of the really common ways that you can experience a kernel panic. If you have an overclocked CPU, for example, that can sometimes cause kernel panics. A bad stick of RAM is another one that'll really do it. And, some add-on card, like video cards are sometimes, guilty of doing this. Really anything on your system, any hardware, if it fails, it can cause a kernel panic. There's a couple ways to, try different things, especially if you have multiple sticks of RAM. Sometimes you can pull out a stick of RAM, see if you still get a kernel panic. If you do, then put that stick back in and keep pulling them out one at a time and see if the kernel panics automatically go away when you remove one certain stick. Hey, chances are that's what's wrong with, that certain stick is a bad stick of RAM. It can be frustrating to track down hardware related kernel panics, but there's also another very common kind of kernel panic that happens, and that's when you upgrade your system. So let's say that you just ran a system update on your system and it installed a new kernel. You reboot the computer and then boom, it says something like failure to init or kernel panic, blah, 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 blah. If that happens, there is something that you can do, which is fairly easy to do, and you can, rescue your system, so to speak. So when it boots up, we're just going to go into Grub and we're going to pick an older kernel, because when you update a system, it keeps the older kernel for this exact reason. If something goes wrong, you can pick a different kernel and boot the system and then fix it. So I'll show you what I mean. Here we are on our Ubuntu system, and let's say I just recently updated it, and during the update it says now I need to restart my system. So I'm going to restart the system and everything should go well, blah, 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 blah. And then boom, we get a kernel panic. Now this doesn't actually give us the words kernel panic because I did something fairly simple to simulate what would happen if there was some corruption in the kernel. But it says here, it's unable to find the init RD. Sometimes you might see kernel panic init or unable to kill init or something like that. It says press any key to continue, but there's nothing that's going to happen, right? It's kind of locked up on me because it errored out. There's no init RD. So what we're going to do is restart the system. And when we do that, we're going to initiate the grub menu by holding down the shift key. So first of all, we do need to restart the computer. I'm going to hold down the shift key and we should get presented with a grub menu. Sure enough, here's our grub menu. Advanced options, and we're going to see here we have multiple kernels. This is the kernel, the newest one is the one that it tried to boot by default, so I'm just going to go back to the last successful kernel that we had. Press enter, and it should boot this up and our system should be just fine. Then all we need to do is remove that kernel package with the failed thing using our apt system, reinstall it again, do an update so it reinstalls, and then it should install that init RD back in place, and we should be fine. So it's nice that Linux keeps a few of the older kernels kind of in line so that we can do exactly this. If something goes wrong with one kernel, or we've deleted modules, or just something doesn't load, or we get a kernel panic, we can select a previously successful kernel, and then here we are on our system working perfectly, and now we can go through and remove that package and fix it, etc., etc., etc. So if you do get the kernel panic, especially on a production system, it can be really scary. But know that there are ways, to fix it. If it's just a kernel corruption, you can boot to a previous kernel. If it's a hardware issue, it's a little harder to troubleshoot. But you can also do something like boot from a USB drive or a CD, and at the very least, you'll be able to access the hard drives so that you can get stuff off of your computer if it is a hardware failure that's causing the problem, and then you'll have your data to put onto a new computer. But kernel panics are no reason to panic. It's just one more thing that we need to understand how is working so we can fix it or troubleshoot the problem and move on from there. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.